I spent my entire life watching my younger brother Jason get handed everything on a silver platter while I was expected to fend for myself, to figure things out, to be the one who didn't need help, didn't need attention, didn't need anything from anyone. It wasn't just about money, though that was a big part of it. It was about the way our parents treated us, the way they saw Jason as the one worth investing in, the one worth their time, their resources, their energy, while I was just there, existing in the background, expected to be strong, independent, and self-sufficient from the moment I could walk. From the time we were kids, it was obvious who the favorite was, even if no one ever said it out loud. Jason was the baby of the family, the charming one, the one who could flash a smile and get away with anything, the one who always had our parents wrapped around his finger, no matter how many times he screwed up. If he got bad grades, my mother would sit with him for hours, helping him with his homework, telling him he was smart, just misunderstood by his teachers. If I got bad grades, on the rare occasion I did, it was because I wasn't applying myself and needed to work harder. If Jason wrecked his bike, my father would take him to the store that same afternoon and buy him a brand new one, better than the last. When I broke my bike, I was told to save my allowance and fix it myself, because that's what being responsible looks like. By the time we were teenagers, the gap between us had only widened. Jason never had a job, never had to worry about money, never had to think twice about whether our parents would cover his expenses, because they always did without question. He drove a brand new car the second he got his license, went on expensive spring break trips with his friends, always had the latest clothes, the newest tech, the best of everything. Meanwhile, I worked part-time at a grocery store after school, saving every dollar I could just to afford a used car that barely ran, paying for my own gas, my own phone bill, my own clothes, because I had been told from an early age that I needed to learn the value of a dollar. It wasn't that I resented working hard. I actually took pride in it, in knowing that everything I had earned myself, in knowing that I didn't need handouts or favors to stand on my own. But there was something about the blatant unfairness of it all, the way my parents bent over backward to make sure Jason never struggled while expecting me to shoulder the weight of responsibility on my own, that never sat right with me. Still, I kept telling myself that it didn't matter, that I would build my own life, that I didn't need their help, their approval, or their money to be successful. For years, I convinced myself that as long as I worked hard, as long as I focused on my own path, as long as I didn't let it get to me, I would be fine. I went to college on scholarships and part-time jobs while Jason had his tuition fully paid for without lifting a finger. I graduated with student loans and immediately started grinding my way up in my career, while Jason floundered, hopping from one failed business venture to another, always knowing that if things didn't work out, Mom and Dad would be there to catch him, to bail him out, to throw more money at whatever mess he had made. And they always did. Every single time Jason screwed up, they were there, writing the checks, making excuses, covering for him, acting like it was just a rough patch or bad luck, as if he wasn't an adult who had been given every opportunity and still managed to fail. And every single time I watched silently as they drained their savings, as they dipped into their retirement funds, as they spent money they...
Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
didn't have to keep Jason afloat, all while telling me that I should be proud of myself for being so independent, for not needing anything from them. For years, I told myself it didn't matter, until they asked me to fix their mistake. It was over dinner one night, one of the rare occasions when I actually agreed to come over, when I let myself sit at the table with them and pretend, for just a little while, that we were a normal family. The conversation had been light, casual, filled with small talk about work and life, and for a brief moment, I almost let myself believe that things were fine, that the years of resentment, of feeling like an outsider in my own family, weren't sitting between us like an invisible wall. And then, just as we were finishing dessert, my mother cleared her throat, glancing at my father, who gave her a small nod, as if they had rehearsed this moment, as if they had planned exactly how to present it to me. "We wanted to talk to you about something important," she started, her voice soft, careful, the way it always was when she was about to ask for something she knew she shouldn't be asking for. I set my fork down, already feeling a knot forming in my stomach. "Okay," I said slowly. "What is it?" My father leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his expression serious. "Your mother and I. We're getting older," he said, as if this was some grand revelation. "We've been looking at our finances, and well, things aren't as secure as we'd like them to be." I frowned slightly, unsure where this was going. "What do you mean?" My mother let out a small sigh, reaching for my hand like she thought the physical connection would make me more receptive to what she was about to say. "We need help, sweetheart," she said, her voice almost pleading. "Your father and I, we've always done our best to support this family, to make sure you and Jason had what you needed, but Well, we weren't exactly planning for how expensive retirement would be. And with the economy being what it is. She trailed off, waiting for me to fill in the blanks. And then, just like that, the pieces clicked together. They had spent everything. Every last cent. They had drained their savings, poured their retirement funds into Jason's life, covered his debts, paid for his failures, made sure he never once had to feel the consequences of his own actions. And now that there was nothing left, now that they were staring down the reality of growing old without a financial safety net, now that they had finally realized what they had done, they were turning to me. They expected me to fix it. I felt my entire body go still, my heartbeat thudding in my ears, my stomach twisting with something I couldn't quite name. Anger, disbelief, maybe even a hint of dark amusement at the sheer audacity of it all. "You want me to pay for your retirement?" I asked, my voice calm but sharp, my words cutting through the quiet hum of the dining room. My father nodded, as if it were the most reasonable request in the world. "You're the responsible one, Alex," he said simply. "You've always been good with money. It only makes sense." And just like that, I realized something. They had never expected Jason to take care of them. Not once. Not ever. Because they had always known, deep down, that he wouldn't. And now, they were looking at me to clean up their mess. I sat there, staring at my parents across the dining table, feeling the weight of their expectations settle over me like a thick, suffocating fog pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. They weren't asking me to help. They were telling me that I had to, that it was my responsibility, that I owed it to them after everything they had done, after all the years they had spent raising me, after the sacrifices they claimed to have made. The worst part wasn't the demand itself. It was the fact that they genuinely believed they were entitled to it, that there was no hesitation, no shame, no acknowledgement of the blatant unfairness of what they were saying. My father sat back in his chair, his expression calm, serious, completely devoid of any doubt, as if he had already made the decision for me. As if my opinion on the matter was nothing more than a minor inconvenience that would soon be dealt with. "Alex, we aren't asking you to do anything unreasonable," he said, his tone measured. His voice carrying that same unwavering authority he had used when I was a kid, the same voice that had once convinced me that his word was law, that his decisions were final. "You've done well for yourself. You have a good job, you make smart financial decisions. You're in a position where this won't be a burden on you." I exhaled slowly, pressing my fingers against my temple, feeling the dull beginnings of a headache creeping in. "A burden," I repeated, my voice sharper than I intended, my patience fraying at the edges. "You do realize what you're asking, right? You want me to fund your entire retirement because you spent everything on Jason." At the mention of his name, my brother, who had been sitting at the table like a guest instead of someone equally responsible for this disaster, scoffed under his breath, barely looking up from his phone. "Oh, come on, man," he muttered, shaking his head like I was being dramatic, like I was blowing this out of proportion. "You're acting like they blew it all in Vegas. They took care of us, dude. They made sure we had what we needed. Now it's just your turn to help them out." I turned to him slowly, my blood boiling at the sheer audacity of his words, at the way he sat there so casually, so unaffected, as if this had nothing to do with him, as if he wasn't the reason our parents were broke, as if I was the selfish one for even questioning this ridiculous request. "No, Jason," I said, my voice dangerously low. "They made sure you had what you needed. They covered your bills. They paid for your mistakes. They spent their entire savings making sure you never had to struggle. And now that there's nothing left, now that they're finally facing the consequences of their choices, they expect me to clean it up." Jason finally looked up from his phone, frowning slightly, like he was just now realizing that I wasn't going to just roll over and accept this, like he had genuinely assumed that I would take on this responsibility without question. "Dude, why are you making this a big deal?" he asked, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, his face twisting into something that almost resembled amusement. "You've always been good with money. It's not like you can't afford it." My mother reached across the table, placing her hand on mine, her touch light, gentle, the same way it had always been when she was trying to manipulate me, when she was trying to soften the blow of something she knew I wouldn't want to hear. "Sweetheart, we're a family," she said softly, her voice dripping with that same artificial warmth that had always made me uneasy. "Families take care of each other. We took care of you when you were growing up. We made sure you had everything you needed. And now we're just asking you to do the same for us." I pulled my hand away, inhaling sharply, my patience wearing thin. "You didn't take care of me," I snapped, my voice finally rising, my frustration spilling over like a dam that had finally cracked. "You took care of Jason. You paid for his college, his cars, his rent, his entire life. Meanwhile, I worked 2 jobs to put myself through school. I bought my own car. I built my own life without a single dime from you. And now, after all of that, you expect me to step up and fix the mess you made." My father let out a heavy sigh, rubbing a hand over his face like I was being difficult, like I was disappointing him by not immediately bending to his will. "Alex, it's not about the past," he said, his voice firm, his patience thinning. "It's about doing what's right. Your mother and I are getting older, and we don't have the luxury of waiting around for some magical solution. You have the means to help, and as our son, that should be enough of a reason for you to do the right thing." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head in disbelief at the sheer entitlement of it all. "The right thing," I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Tell me, Dad, when exactly did Jason do the right thing? When was he expected to be responsible? When did he have to make sacrifices? When was he ever held accountable for anything?" Jason rolled his eyes, groaning like this conversation was exhausting him, like my resistance was nothing more than an inconvenience to him. "Dude, give it a rest," he muttered, shaking his head. "You've always been such a hard-ass about this stuff. I mean, come on, they're our parents. Just do the right thing and help them out." I stared at him, my pulse pounding in my ears, my vision blurring at the edges with sheer, unfiltered rage. This was his mess. This was his doing. He had spent years living off of them, bleeding them dry, taking everything they had without a second thought, and yet, he had the audacity to sit there and act like I was the problem, like I was the one being unreasonable, like I was the selfish one for refusing to sacrifice my own future to fix the mistakes he had caused. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm, to think clearly, to push down the urge to explode. I looked at my parents, at the people who had spent my entire life treating me like I didn't matter as much as Jason, at the people who had expected me to be the responsible one but had never once respected me for it. And in that moment I made my decision. I leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with my father, my voice calm, steady, filled with a finality that left no room for argument. "No." The single word hung in the air like a gunshot, the silence that followed thick and suffocating, the weight of it pressing down on all of us, settling into every corner of the room. My mother's face fell, her lips parting slightly in shock, as if she had never even considered the possibility that I might refuse. My father's expression darkened, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Jason just stared at me, his mouth slightly open, completely dumbfounded, as if he had never once imagined a world where I didn't step up and take responsibility. "I'm not paying for your mistakes," I continued, my voice unwavering. "I'm not cleaning up after Jason. I'm not fixing the mess you created. You made your choices. Now you can live with them." And with that, I stood up, grabbed my jacket and walked out, leaving them sitting there in stunned silence, for the first time in their lives realizing that I was no longer someone they could control. The silence that followed my words was so thick and heavy it almost felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, like time itself had paused for a moment, as if my parents and Jason couldn't quite process what I had just said. I had spent my entire life being the one they could rely on, the one who never made trouble, the one who always took responsibility even when it wasn't mine to take. But now, for the first time, I was saying no, and they had no idea how to handle it. Jason was the first to react, letting out a short, disbelieving laugh, shaking his head like I had just told the dumbest joke he had ever heard. "All right, man, that was a good one," he said, smirking as he leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms behind his head. "But seriously, cut the act. We all know you're going to do it." I didn't smile. I didn't laugh. I didn't play along. I just stared at him, my expression blank, my hands folded on the table, my body still, letting the weight of my refusal sink in. Jason's smirk wavered slightly, the confidence in his voice faltering for the first time. "Wait," he said, sitting up straighter, frowning now. "You're serious?" I exhaled slowly, nodding once. "Yeah, Jason," I said, my voice calm, measured, leaving no room for doubt. "I'm serious." My mother let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her chest like I had just struck her, her face contorting with shock and betrayal. "Alex," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You can't mean that." My father, who had been eerily quiet up until that moment, finally spoke, his voice sharp and controlled, laced with the authority he had always used to get his way. "Enough," he said, his jaw tightening, his fingers pressing into the table. "This isn't a debate. You're our son, and we need you to do this." I turned to look at him, meeting his gaze without flinching, refusing to let the weight of his words intimidate me the way they had when I was younger, refusing to let him make me feel like a disobedient child simply because I was standing my ground. You need me to do this, I repeated, my voice steady, forcing myself to stay calm despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. No, Dad. You expect me to do this. And I'm telling you right now, it's not going to happen. Jason groaned loudly, rubbing his hands over his face like this entire conversation was exhausting him. Dude, why are you being so dramatic? He muttered, shaking his head. You've got the money. It's not like you can't afford it. I turned to him, narrowing my eyes, my patience wearing dangerously thin. That's not the point, Jason, I snapped, my voice sharper now, my frustration finally breaking through. The point is that you got everything, every bit of financial help, every bailout, every favor, while I was expected to handle everything on my own. And now that our parents are broke because of you, now that they have nothing left because they spent it all on you, they suddenly want me to be the one who fixes it. Well, absolutely not. Jason scoffed, rolling his eyes like I was overreacting. Man, you're so bitter, he muttered under his breath. You've always been bitter about this. I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head at his sheer inability to understand the reality of the situation. Yeah, Jason, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. It is a little frustrating watching our parents bend over backward to give you everything while I was left to fend for myself. But you know what? I dealt with it. I worked hard, I built my own life, and I made sure I wouldn't ever have to rely on them for anything. And now you're sitting here acting like I'm the bad guy because I won't undo the damage you caused. My mother's voice broke through, her tone high-pitched and desperate, her eyes already brimming with tears, as if she thought that guilt would be enough to change my mind. Alex, we raised you, she said, shaking her head, her voice trembling. We gave you a roof over your head, food on your plate, love, support, everything. And now, when we need you, you're just going to abandon us. I clenched my jaw, inhaling deeply, forcing myself to stay calm, to keep my emotions in check, even as my heart pounded with anger. You raised me, I repeated, nodding slowly. You're right about that. You did the bare minimum of what parents are supposed to do. But let's be honest, Mom, you weren't raising me. You were investing in Jason. You made sure he had every opportunity, every advantage, every second chance, while I was left to figure things out on my own. And now that he's failed, now that he's run through everything you gave him, now that there's nothing left, you want me to clean up the mess. My father's expression darkened, his voice dropping to a low growl, the barely contained fury vibrating through every syllable. You owe us, Alex, he said, his voice filled with cold finality. Everything you have today, everything you've built, it's because we raised you to be responsible, because we taught you how to work hard. You wouldn't be where you are if it weren't for us. And now it's time for you to step up as a man and take care of your family. I felt something inside me snap, something deep and long buried finally breaking free, something raw and unfiltered rising to the surface. I had spent my entire life being told that my independence was a good thing, that my ability to stand on my own was something to be proud of, that I should be grateful that I didn't need help the way Jason did. And now, suddenly, that same independence, that same strength, that same success they had always dismissed as my responsibility to achieve, was being used against me, twisted into some kind of debt that I had never agreed to. I pushed my chair back, standing slowly, my hands resting on the table, my voice cold, steady, filled with a finality that left no room for argument. I don't owe you anything, I said, my words sharp and deliberate, cutting through the silence like a blade. Not after the way you treated me. Not after a lifetime of being second to Jason. Not after you spent every last dime making sure he never had to struggle. You made your choices, and now you get to live with them. My mother let out a soft sob, shaking her head in disbelief, as if she had never even considered the possibility that I might refuse. My father's face turned red with fury, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw so tight I could hear his teeth grinding. Jason just stared at me, his mouth slightly open, his mind racing, and for the first time in his life, I saw something in his expression that had never been there before. Panic. Because for the first time, he realized he would have to take responsibility. I let the silence stretch, let them all sit in the reality of what had just happened, let them feel the weight of the truth they had spent years ignoring. Then, without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving them behind to deal with the consequences of their own choices. In the days that followed my refusal, I kept waiting for the inevitable second attempt, for my parents to call me again with a different approach, maybe a softer one, maybe a more manipulative one, maybe even an apology laced with just the right amount of guilt to make me second-guess myself. But the silence stretched on longer than I expected, and at first I thought maybe they had accepted it. Maybe they had finally realized that I wasn't going to bail them out, that they would have to deal with the consequences of their own actions. But deep down I knew better. I knew my parents, I knew Jason, and I knew that when people like them were faced with reality they didn't change. They just looked for another way out. And reality, it seemed, was finally starting to hit them like a brick to the face. I started hearing whispers about their situation before they even reached out again, overhearing conversations through mutual friends, getting vague, carefully worded questions from people who had once been close to my parents but now seemed unsure of where they stood. My mother had always prided herself on maintaining the image of a perfect life, surrounding herself with people who admired the lifestyle she had cultivated, the expensive vacations, the lavish dinner parties, the high-end shopping sprees. But all of those things had been built on a foundation that was crumbling beneath them, and the second the money started running out, people started noticing. My parents weren't the type to admit when they were struggling, but the cracks were beginning to show. There were no more extravagant parties, no more casual mentions of upcoming trips, no more expensive gifts being handed out just to maintain appearances. Their closest friends, the ones who had once flocked to their side whenever there was a celebration, were now distancing themselves, sensing the shift, sensing the desperation, sensing that the people they had once admired weren't as untouchable as they had seemed. And then there was Jason. Jason, who had never once had to worry about money, who had never once had to check his bank account before making a purchase, who had always assumed that no matter how bad things got, there would always be a safety net waiting for him, was finally being forced to face something he had never experienced before: consequences. At first, he didn't take it seriously. He brushed it off like it was just another minor inconvenience, just another rough patch, just another thing that would sort itself out once our parents figured out a way to fix it. He kept spending like he always had, refusing to cut back, refusing to acknowledge that the money was gone, refusing to believe that this time, there wasn't going to be another bailout. But reality has a way of creeping in, slow at first, then all at once, and it wasn't long before the bills started piling up, before the credit cards stopped going through, before the people he had always relied on for favors started turning him away. He still had the apartment our parents had paid for, but without a steady stream of money coming in, the rent became an issue almost immediately. The landlord, who had once been more than happy to accommodate Jason's carefree attitude, suddenly wasn't so patient when the payments started getting later and later. The expensive car he had been driving, the one our parents had leased under their names, was repossessed within weeks. The endless nights out, the impulsive purchases, the designer clothes and overpriced meals, all of it came to a screeching halt when he finally realized that there was no one left to foot the bill. I didn't hear from him directly at first, but I knew he was struggling. I heard it through mutual acquaintances, people who had once praised Jason for his charm and carefree spirit, now shaking their heads, murmuring about how he had fallen on hard times. It was almost amusing in a dark way, how quickly people turned their backs when the money dried up, how fast admiration turned into quiet pity, how the people who had once treated Jason like he was special, like he was someone worth knowing, were now avoiding him like he was contagious. And then, finally, the call came. I was sitting in my apartment, sipping my coffee, enjoying a rare moment of peace when my phone buzzed. I glanced down at the screen and saw Jason's name flashing, and for a brief second, I debated whether or not to answer. I already knew why he was calling, already knew the exact tone his voice would have, already knew the words he would say before he even said them. I let it ring 3 times before picking up, keeping my voice even neutral, giving him no indication of how I felt. "Hello." There was a long pause on the other end, just the sound of Jason exhaling like he was trying to collect himself, like he was trying to find the right words, like he hated that he even had to make this call in the first place. "Alex," he finally said. His voice quieter than usual, missing that usual smug confidence, that entitled ease he always carried. "Hey man, how's it going?" I almost laughed at the forced casualness, at the way he was trying to act like this was just another normal conversation, like he wasn't about to ask me for something, like he wasn't about to beg. "I'm fine," I said simply, not offering anything more, not making this easy for him. "What do you want, Jason?" Another pause, another breath, another second of hesitation before he finally dropped the act. His voice shifting into something raw, something desperate, something he had probably never had to use in his entire life. "Look man," he said, exhaling heavily. "I need help." There it was. The words I had been expecting. The moment I had been waiting for. The inevitable reality finally catching up to him, forcing him to confront something he had spent his entire life avoiding. The fact that he wasn't special, that he wasn't above the rules, that he wasn't immune to failure. I let the silence stretch between us, let him sit in it, let him feel what it was like to be the one on the other side for once, to be the one asking, to be the one waiting for an answer. And then, slowly, a small smirk tugged at the corner of my lips as I finally spoke. "Funny," I said, my voice calm, deliberate, filled with something that almost resembled amusement. "I thought you said this wasn't a big deal." Jason didn't laugh. When Jason called again the next day, I let it go to voicemail, not because I didn't want to hear what he had to say, but because I wanted him to sit with the weight of it for a little longer, wanted him to feel, if only for a moment, what it was like to be ignored, to be the one needing help, to be the one left waiting for a response that might never come. He had spent his entire life with the certainty that someone, our parents, their money, their endless willingness to clean up his mistakes, would always be there to catch him, to make sure he never had to feel the consequences of his own recklessness. But this time there was no safety net. This time he had fallen, and there was no one rushing to break his landing. When I finally called him back, he answered on the first ring, his voice breathless, his desperation barely concealed beneath the thin layer of forced casualness he still clung to, as if he could somehow pretend that this was just a normal conversation, that he wasn't about to ask for something he never thought he would need. "Alex, man, thanks for calling me back," he said, laughing lightly, though there was no real humor in it. "I was starting to think you were ignoring me." I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window, my fingers tapping lightly against the armrest as I let the silence stretch between us just long enough to make him uncomfortable, just long enough to remind him that, this time, I wasn't the one scrambling for an answer. "I was," I said simply, my voice even, giving him nothing to work with, no hint of sympathy, no reassurance, just the cold, hard truth. Jason let out a small, nervous chuckle, but it faded quickly, replaced by the quiet sound of him exhaling, like he knew he couldn't dance around this any longer. "Listen, man," he finally said. His voice lower now, more serious, more raw. "I need your help. Things have been rough, you know? The money situation, the bills, the rent. It's all piling up, and I don't know what to do." I closed my eyes for a moment, inhaling slowly, letting his words settle over me, not because I was surprised, but because I had spent my entire life knowing that this moment would come eventually, knowing that one day, the endless well of financial support our parents had poured into him would run dry, knowing that when it did, he wouldn't know how to handle it. "And what exactly do you want me to do about that, Jason?" I asked, my tone deliberately neutral, refusing to give him anything to latch onto. He hesitated, as if he hadn't expected me to be so blunt, as if he thought I would at least pretend to care, as if he thought I would immediately offer to fix everything the way our parents always had. "I just need a little help," he said quickly, the words rushed, eager, as if saying them faster would make them easier to swallow. "Just enough to get me back on my feet, you know? Cover a couple of bills, maybe help out with rent for a few months. I swear, man, once I get things sorted, I'll pay you back. I just need a little time to figure things out." I let out a slow, quiet laugh, shaking my head, my fingers tightening around the phone. "Time," I repeated, arching an eyebrow. "Jason, you've had nothing but time your entire life. You had every opportunity, every advantage, every single thing handed to you, and you threw it all away. And now, because you finally ran out of money, because you finally hit the bottom, you expect me to be the one to pull you back up." Jason sighed heavily, his frustration creeping into his voice, the desperation now mixing with something else, something bitter, something that told me he still didn't fully understand the position he was in. "Come on, man," he muttered. "You know I didn't mean for things to turn out like this. You act like I planned to fail, like I wanted this to happen. He paused, inhaling sharply. "Look, I messed up, all right? But it's not like you can't help. You're doing fine, right? You've always had your shit together. What's a few grand to you?" I laughed again, but this time there was no humor in it, just disbelief, just that same familiar sting of resentment, that same frustration I had swallowed for years, the same anger I had buried every time I watched him get rewarded for doing nothing while I had to work twice as hard just to be noticed. "You still don't get it, do you?" I asked, my voice cold now, sharper, cutting straight through whatever illusion he had been clinging to. "This isn't about money, Jason. This is about the fact that you have never once taken responsibility for anything in your entire life. And now, when you're finally being forced to, you still think you can talk your way out of it, still think you can find some way to make this my problem instead of yours." Jason didn't say anything for a moment, and for the first time in the conversation I thought maybe, just maybe, he was finally beginning to understand. But then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed with another call, and when I glanced at the screen, I saw my mother's name flashing. Course. They must have realized Jason wasn't getting anywhere on his own, must have decided that it was time to step in, to do what they had always done, to try and guilt me into giving in. I let it ring. "Mom's calling, isn't she?" Jason muttered, his voice flat, resigned, as if even he knew how predictable they had become. "Yeah," I said simply, watching the phone vibrate, letting the call go to voicemail without a second thought. "Guess she's finally ready to make her case." Jason exhaled heavily, his voice quieter now, less defensive, more tired. "She's just worried, man," he said, almost like he was trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince me. "They don't know what to do. They never thought." He stopped, swallowing hard. "They never thought you'd actually say no." I let his words hang in the air for a moment, let the silence stretch between us, let him feel, for just a second, what it was like to be left with nothing but the truth. Then slowly, a small smirk tugged at the corner of my lips as I finally spoke, my voice calm, even, filled with the same quiet certainty that had been missing from my life for far too long. "You never cared about fairness before," I said simply. And then, before he could argue, before he could come up with another excuse, before he could say anything else to try and shift the blame, I hung up. It didn't take long for the reality of the situation to sink in, for my parents to fully understand that, this time, there wasn't going to be a last-minute save. No unexpected miracle. No generous check from their responsible son to wipe away their mistakes and let them continue living as if nothing had changed. They had spent decades throwing money at Jason, propping him up, making sure he never had to struggle, ensuring that he always had a comfortable place to land no matter how many times he crashed. But now, for the first time in their lives, they had to face something they had never been prepared for, the consequences of their own choices. The first real sign that things were unraveling came when I heard, through a mutual acquaintance, that my parents were putting their house on the market. The same house where I had grown up, the same house that had once been the stage for so many family gatherings, the same house where I had sat across from them at the dining table as they told me, without an ounce of hesitation, that I was expected to pay for their retirement. I had known it was coming, of course, when you burn through every dollar you have, when you put all your eggs in the basket of a son who has never worked a day in his life, when you expect someone else to clean up the mess for you, eventually you run out of options. Still, I couldn't deny that there was something deeply satisfying about it, something almost poetic about the fact that the very thing they had spent years protecting, the home, the status, the illusion of wealth, was the first thing they had to let go of. They had always been so concerned with appearances, so obsessed with making sure the world saw them as successful, as a family worth admiring, as people who had built something worth envying. But now, with the walls closing in around them, with their finances in ruin, with Jason unable to do anything but flounder, they had no choice but to downsize, to sell off the very thing that had once been the foundation of their carefully curated image. And Jason was drowning. Without the constant influx of money from our parents, without the steady flow of financial support that had always cushioned his every mistake, he was left scrambling to maintain the lifestyle he had once taken for granted. The apartment he had been living in, the one they had been paying for, was suddenly too expensive. The credit cards he had once swiped without thinking were now maxed out. The people who had once surrounded him, feeding off his generosity, were nowhere to be found. Turns out, when you build your life on borrowed wealth, when you spend years convincing yourself that money will always be there, when you believe that responsibility is something other people have to deal with, you don't have the skills to survive when it all disappears. I heard through the grapevine that Jason had started asking around for jobs, something he had never had to do before, something he clearly had no idea how to handle. The same man who had once rolled his eyes at me for working through college, the same brother who had laughed at my boring life, the same person who had once told me that he wasn't built for the 9-to-5 grind, was now out in the world, realizing that without money, without privilege, without our parents there to shield him, he was just like everyone else. But unlike everyone else, he had no experience, no skills, no understanding of how the world actually worked. And the people who had once admired him, they were starting to admire me instead. It was strange at first, hearing the shift in conversations, feeling the subtle change in how our parents' old friends, the same ones who had once fawned over Jason, were suddenly more interested in my success, in my story, in the way I had managed to build a stable life without handouts, without shortcuts, without the endless financial safety nets that had kept Jason afloat for years. "Alex, I always knew you were the responsible one," one of my mother's friends told me at a gathering I had attended out of sheer curiosity, wanting to see firsthand how the tides were turning. "You were the one who made something of yourself, the one who worked hard, the one who didn't need anyone else to succeed. It's so refreshing to see someone who actually understands the value of hard work." I didn't respond, didn't bother to remind her that these same people had once ignored me, had once acted as if Jason was the real success story, had once laughed along with him when he made snide comments about how boring and predictable my life was. They were just like my parents, just like Jason, people who only cared about who was winning, people who shifted their admiration based on who had the upper hand. But I wasn't looking for admiration. I was looking for something else. And that's when I made the decision that shocked everyone. When I found out my parents' house was officially up for sale, I knew what I had to do. Bought it. Not out of sentimentality. Not because I wanted to hold on to some piece of my childhood. Not because I wanted to repair some fractured relationship with my past. No, I bought it because I wanted to make sure that they, my parents, Jason, everyone who had ever looked at me as less than, understood exactly what had happened. I bought it quietly, without telling them, without making a big deal out of it, without giving them any warning. I let them believe, right up until the last moment, that they would be selling it to some anonymous buyer, some faceless stranger, someone who would take it off their hands and leave them with nothing but the memories of what they had lost. And then, when the papers were signed, when the deal was finalized, when they had no choice but to pack up their things and leave, I made sure they knew. I made sure they understood. I was the one who owned it now. The house that they had once refused to consider mine. The home they had always treated as Jason's future inheritance. The thing they had spent years believing I had no claim to. It belonged to me now. And as I stood in the driveway, watching my parents and Jason loading the last of their things into a car, their faces pale, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, humiliation, and something dangerously close to resentment, I finally spoke the words that had been sitting on the tip of my tongue for years. "Funny," I said, my voice calm, steady, filled with the weight of everything that had led to this moment. "I always thought this place was Jason's future. Guess I was wrong." Jason didn't say a word. My mother looked like she wanted to cry. My father refused to meet my eyes. And as they drove away, leaving behind the home they had once been so proud of, the home they had once believed I would never have any claim to, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I had spent my entire life being the one who was overlooked, the one who never asked for help, the one who was expected to figure things out on my own while Jason was given everything without a second thought. My parents had spent years making excuses for him, pouring their money, their energy, their entire future into ensuring that he never had to struggle, never had to experience hardship, never had to take responsibility for his own life. And now, after everything, after all the years of being treated like an afterthought, after all the years of being told that I didn't need the same support Jason got, after being expected to fund their retirement because they had drained every last cent keeping my brother afloat, I was the one left standing. And they were the ones who had lost everything. Buying the house had been a simple, almost effortless decision, one that came with a sense of finality, a sense of quiet, undeniable justice that no amount of words or apologies could erase. I hadn't done it out of some misplaced sense of sentimentality, hadn't done it because I wanted to cling to my past, hadn't done it because I was hoping to reclaim something that had once been denied to me. No, I had done it for one reason and one reason only, to make sure that they understood, to make sure they felt it. I had let them believe, right up until the last moment, that they would be selling the house to some stranger, some anonymous buyer, someone who had no connection to the past they had spent years constructing around Jason's so-called future. And then, when the papers were signed, when the last box had been packed, when the weight of reality had fully settled onto their shoulders, I made sure they knew exactly who owned it now. Jason was the first to find out, and the moment he realized the truth was something I would remember for the rest of my life. It had happened on a cold afternoon, one of those days where the air felt sharper than usual, where everything seemed a little quieter, a little more still, as if the world itself was waiting for the final piece of this story to fall into place. I had been standing in the front yard of my new home, my hands tucked into my pockets, watching as the last of my parents' old furniture was being loaded onto a moving truck, when I heard the sound of a car pulling up to the curb. I turned just in time to see Jason step out. His expression bored, indifferent, the same look he had always worn when he had the luxury of believing nothing could touch him, nothing could shake his carefully maintained world. But then his gaze landed on me standing in front of his old house, on me watching as the final pieces of his former life were being taken away, on me looking completely and utterly at peace. And in that moment I saw it. I saw the exact second the realization hit him, saw the exact second he understood what had happened, saw the exact second his usual cocky, dismissive smirk faltered and twisted into something else entirely. Something raw, something furious, something dangerously close to panic. "You've got to be kidding me," Jason muttered, slamming the car door shut. His movements sharp, rigid, filled with the kind of tension that only comes from realizing too late that you have lost a game you didn't even know you were playing. I raised an eyebrow, tilting my head slightly as I watched him approach, my expression calm, unreadable, giving him nothing to hold on to, nothing to work with, nothing to twist into an argument he could win. "Something wrong?" I asked, my voice casual, relaxed, as if this was just another day, as if I hadn't just taken away the last thing he had left. Jason let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "This was my house," he snapped, his voice sharp, accusing, as if I had somehow stolen something that had belonged to him, as if this wasn't the exact house our parents had once told me I would never have any claim to. "This was our family's house. What the hell are you even doing here?" I let out a quiet chuckle, shaking my head slightly, pretending to consider his question, pretending to entertain the idea that he didn't already know the answer. "Well," I said, exhaling slowly, letting the words stretch between us, letting him feel them before I finally spoke again. "I own it now." Jason's entire body stiffened, his jaw tightening, his hands still clenched at his sides like he was holding back the urge to punch something, like he was trying to force himself to process something that he simply couldn't accept. "No," he muttered, shaking his head again, almost as if he was trying to convince himself more than he was trying to convince me. "No, there's no way. You're messing with me. Mom and Dad wouldn't." I cut him off before he could finish, my voice even, sharp, leaving no room for argument. "Mom and Dad didn't have a choice," I said simply, shrugging slightly. "They had to sell, and I had the money to buy it. Simple as that." Jason took a step back, his breath coming a little faster now, his eyes darting between me and the house, as if he was searching for some way out of this, as if he was looking for a loophole that didn't exist. "You did this on purpose," he accused, his voice lower now, filled with something I hadn't heard from him before, genuine fear. "You wanted this to happen." I took a step closer, just enough to make sure he was listening, just enough to make sure that when I spoke next, he would hear every single word, every single syllable, every single ounce of meaning behind them. "You're right," I said quietly, nodding once, my eyes never leaving his. "I did want this. I wanted you to understand what it feels like to have everything taken away, to watch as the things you thought were yours slip through your fingers, to finally feel what it's like to have nothing left." Jason swallowed hard, his breathing unsteady, his shoulders rising and falling just a little too fast, his entire body practically vibrating with frustration, with disbelief, with a realization that, for the first time in his life, he had lost. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for the perfect moment to add one final twist to this story, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, glancing at the screen, already knowing what I would see. It was our parents. They were calling me, begging no doubt, pleading for a second chance, hoping that now that I had proven my point, now that they had seen what I was capable of, I would change my mind, that I would swoop in and fix things, that I would suddenly become the son they had always assumed I would be when they needed me most. I let the phone ring, my gaze still locked on Jason, my expression unreadable. Then, just before the call went to voicemail, I smirked, shaking my head slightly as I spoke the words that had been waiting at the edge of my tongue for years. "Funny how family only matters when you need something." And with that, I turned and walked back into my house, closing the door behind me, leaving Jason standing there alone, finally understanding what it felt like to be on the outside looking in. For the first time in my life, I felt what it was like to be completely free, unburdened by expectations that were never fair to begin with, unshackled from the weight of always being the responsible one, unchained from the role my parents had forced onto me the moment they decided Jason was the one who deserved their devotion. I had spent years swallowing my resentment, convincing myself that if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself, if I showed them that I was worthy, they would finally see me, finally acknowledge that I had value beyond just being the one who didn't need their help. But they never did, and maybe they never would, because the truth was, they had never wanted an independent son. They had wanted a safety net, a backup plan, someone to pick up the pieces when Jason inevitably shattered the perfect illusion they had spent their lives maintaining. And yet, despite all of that, despite knowing that I had done nothing wrong, despite understanding on a logical level that I had simply refused to be manipulated one last time, I still found myself wondering late at night, when the world was quiet and there was no one left to argue with, did I go too far? I thought about my parents, about how they had looked at me when they realized they had lost the house, when they realized I wasn't coming to save them, when they realized that, for once, they were the ones left scrambling for answers. I thought about the way my mother had stared at me, her eyes wide, her lips slightly parted, as if she couldn't even comprehend the fact that her oldest son, the one who had always done the right thing, had finally said no. I thought about my father, about how his face had hardened, about how he had clenched his jaw so tightly I thought he might break a tooth, about how, for the first time in his life, He had nothing to say because there was no argument left to make. I thought about Jason, about the way his face had twisted in disbelief, about the panic in his eyes when he realized that this time he had no one left to bail him out, no easy way to talk his way back into comfort, no parents willing to clean up the mess he had made. I had spent years watching him laugh off responsibility, watching him mock my hard work, watching him take and take and take, always knowing that there would be someone willing to give. But now there was no one left, and for the first time in his life, he had to sit with the consequences of his own choices. I had won. I had done what they never thought I would do. I had walked away. And yet, that small voice in the back of my head still whispered, did I go too far? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the question itself was pointless, because it wasn't about what was fair or unfair. It wasn't about whether or not I had acted out of anger. It wasn't about whether or not I could have been kinder, more forgiving, more willing to extend a hand even after everything they had done. It was about the fact that, for the first time, I had chosen myself. For years, my parents had made me feel like I wasn't enough, like my ability to take care of myself meant that I didn't deserve the same love, the same attention, the same generosity that they had showered on Jason without hesitation. They had spent their entire lives making sure he never had to feel what it was like to struggle, never had to face consequences, never had to experience what it was like to stand on his own 2 feet. But in doing so, they had set him up for failure, had built his world on a foundation of sand, had ensured that the moment their money ran out, so would his ability to function in the real world. So no, I didn't go too far. I didn't ruin their lives. I didn't steal from them, didn't manipulate them, didn't betray them. I simply refused to continue playing a game where the rules were stacked against me from the start. They had spent everything they had on Jason, had gambled their entire future on the idea that he would always be able to depend on them, had thrown every dollar, every favor, every last bit of security they had into making sure he never had to face reality. And when reality finally came knocking, they expected me to pay the price. I had spent too many years believing that if I just kept my head down, if I just worked hard enough, if I just stayed responsible, I would eventually earn their respect, their approval, their love. But respect isn't something you earn from people who never valued you to begin with. And love, real love, isn't conditional on what you can provide. Jason wasn't my responsibility. My parents weren't my responsibility. Their mistakes, their choices, their failures, they weren't mine to fix. And now, finally, I was free of them. Jason was still struggling, still floundering, still searching for a way back to the life he had once known, still hoping that somewhere, somehow, another safety net would appear. My parents were trying to adjust, trying to figure out how to live without the comfort they had always taken for granted, trying to understand what it meant to exist in a world where they weren't in control. And me. I was thriving. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next demand, the next expectation, the next impossible burden they would try to place on me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't responsible for anyone but myself, wasn't carrying the weight of other people's failures, wasn't being forced to fix things that were never my fault to begin with. I had walked away and I had won. So no, I didn't go too far. If anything, I should have done it sooner. Because sometimes the only way to win is to walk away.